and think, how did these people actually manage to make it through life, being triggered by the little beans from Fall Guys? And then I developed severe PTSD from Elvis Presley, and I understood. Okay, yeah, maybe I am being a bit goofy here, but it's just to mask the pain, really. I genuinely do become a sobbing, quivering wreck if I look at Elvis Presley too long, or worse, an Elvis Presley impersonator. I'm not even exaggerating either. It began when I was invited to a Halloween party with a specific costume gimmick. That gimmick? Freaking Elvis. Entrance was $5, or if you came dressed as Elvis, you got in free. I did not have an Elvis costume, so I just paid the $5 entrance fee, and I'd say about half of the partygoers skipped the Elvis nonsense too, but that still left 30 or 40 poorly conceived Elvises who had not left the building. And I'm not great with super tight crowds, and the party was way busier than it should have been. It was held in someone's house, and I don't think they realized the draw that the Elvis gimmick would create. There were men trying their best to be the king. There were goofy Elvises dancing in their blue suede shoes. There were sexy Elvises, both female and male, and I even saw one girl using the anonymity of her Elvis mask to repeatedly flash her breasts. And I was glad that I'd shown up in sensible jeans and a strappy top. I can't go wrong with being boring, and I'd gotten a ride with a friend who doesn't drink, so I helped myself to a beer from the keg. I needed it to deal with the ongoing atmosphere. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, as part of the Elvis Ween, guess what singer was playing constantly on the stereo? Absolutely no break from Elvis's greatest hits, playing on repeat via Spotify. And even after my first drink, I was deeply regretting being there, but my friend had wanted to come, and she really loved Elvis. And when I decided to get my second drink, a short female Elvis stumbled up to me and handed me a red plastic cup of beer. She mumbled something about suspicious minds and sort of staggered off. Now, normally I would never accept a drink from a stranger, but even with the Elvis costume, I recognized her as another friend from college. Little did I realize that she wasn't saying suspicious minds, and she was trying to tell me that the drink was suspicious, and could I get rid of it for her. After the events of the party, I asked her why she handled it this way, and she could barely even remember. She said that she was drunk and scared that there was an Elvis who wouldn't leave her alone, and she was worried that her drink was spiked. Of course, being the buzzed idiot I was, and having sensory overload from so much Elvis, I just downed that drink. And I don't think it was roofied or anything. I've been roofied before, sadly, and it didn't feel like that. But there was something in that drink. Something that almost immediately started giving me a headache and the sweats. I started looking around for my friend, trying to tell her that I needed to go and that I really didn't feel good. And that's when I saw him, the most realistic-looking Elvis at the party. He didn't wear a mask, his hair was styled in a pompadour, and he wore Elvis sunglasses and that white rhinestone suit that made the king so famous. And there was only one man that I knew who could look that much like Elvis without actually being Elvis. And remember when I said that I'd been roofied before? Well, I'd been roofied by my ex-boyfriend a year before, and he had that same baby face, that same dark hair, the same build, everything. This was him. The Elvis staring at me across the room was my ex-boyfriend Rodney. I'd had to take a restraining order out against him. I was never able to prove that he was the one who roofied me, but he became what they called a fixated individual after I broke up with him, a complete and utter nut job. And now here he was, dressed as Elvis, watching me from across the room. And I know he was watching me because he did that thing where he used his two fingers to point to his eyes and then to me as to say, "Hey, I'm watching you." And I darted into the other room looking for my friend. Where the hell was she? I squeezed through the crowd, shoving lesser Elvises left and right, and people started yelling at me, telling me to watch it. But I could feel evil Elvis's eyes on me. And sure enough, when I looked around, there he was, slowly walking through the crowd like Michael Myers or some crap, but a perfect depiction of Elvis. I ducked into another room. What was this house, I thought? Why were there so many rooms and so many people dressed as Elvis? Was this even real? Or the drugs from the drink playing havoc with my system? I couldn't really tell in the moment, but I knew that I had to get out of there. The Elvis was still pursuing me, and I tried to tell myself that it was just the drugs and alcohol, but he was slowly following me, and I think that I must have just kept looping around the house, barely coherent because he always seemed to be there. Eventually, I found myself outside in the front yard. More Elvises milled around and music was playing from some type of outdoor system. I turned to the front door and Evil Elvis stood there. There was no mistaking it. It was my ex-boyfriend, Rod. He had this sort of knowing, smug grin on his face that was so familiar to me. The terror of him catching me was unspeakable. And then, despite pursuing me slowly for most of the night, he just suddenly leaped down the porch steps and came running directly at me. His sunglasses stayed on his face, his Elvis sideburns obscured his features somewhat, and I was certain it was him though. Why else would he be charging at me? I was confused, but I screamed, I turned to run, and my legs just gave out from under me. This evil Rodney Elvis was on top of me, grabbing at me, grabbing at my hair and my clothes, and I have no idea what he had planned. It was like he was trying to just strip me naked, there on the front lawn in front of numerous other people. Rodney always was some complete psychopath, especially when he was on coke or some other drug, which was often. Thankfully, the crowd didn't take kindly to an Elvis Presley impersonator trying to violate me out front. The biggest, fattest Elvis I'd ever seen came thundering along the lawn, and I later realized that he was wearing a fat suit as part of his costume, and the whole shtick was Elvis just before he died. At the time, though, the hamburger sticking out of his jacket pockets just made me feel like I was going mad, but I didn't care. Fat Elvis leaped the final distance towards Evil Elvis, my boyfriend, my ex-boyfriend, and body slammed him so hard that the pair of them went flying across the lawn. I pulled myself to my feet, unfortunately puking as I did so, which in retrospect I think saved me from whatever dodgy drug had been slipped into that drink earlier in the night. Fat Elvis was doing his best to stomp on Evil Elvis, but his bulk, or rather the fat suit, was getting in the way. But now others were joining in. This group of random Elvis Presleys just absolutely pounding on Evil Elvis. And that's when my ex-boyfriend rolled free and pulled out a gun. And within seconds he fired, hitting Fat Elvis square in the stomach. This Fat Elvis reeled back, fell over, and the other Elvises kind of held up their hands in surrender, backing away from Evil Elvis as he stepped away. He fired one more shot into the air, causing everyone to duck, and then just took off into the darkness around the side of the house. A couple of the Elvises wanted to follow him, but the rest of us told them not to. The guy was armed. And then I told him that I knew who he was and we could just call the cops. And now, after all the chaos, skip forward a few hours. I found my friend, who took me to the police station, and I explained everything. I told them that my attacker was my ex-boyfriend Rodney and explained the history. They ended up looking him up, and the officer gave me this very strange and grave look. Rodney had been arrested a day ago for armed robbery on a convenience store in a completely different state, she explained. And she went on to tell me that he was still in custody and had been so for at least 24 hours. Now, I kept insisting. I was certain that that Evil Elvis was Rodney, and she even put a call into the sheriff's department where he was being held. No question, he was still incarcerated. There was no humanly possible way that Evil Elvis was Rodney. And later they questioned him about the incident, and apparently he was just completely clueless, and they told me he even seemed to express genuine concern for me. And there you have it. A couple of years ago, I was stalked and attacked by an Evil Elvis impersonator who appeared off in the night, and I have absolutely no idea who he was or why he targeted me. He looked so much like Rodney that I could swear that it was him, but there was no way it was, and so now anytime I see anyone dressed like the King, even Elvis himself, I remember back to that Halloween party, and I think about what he tried to do to me and what could have happened. One piece of good news was that plus-size Elvis, like I mentioned, was wearing what turned out to be an extremely large and cumbersome fatsuit. He was a skinny guy, and that meant that the bullet from Elvis's handgun was actually blocked by all the foam in that costume. So, plus-size Elvis, who actually turned out to be a friend of mine from college under all that makeup and fatsuit, was absolutely fine. Now, I have no idea what became of Evil Elvis. I'll scour the news for an Elvis impersonator committing violent crimes, but I've never found anything like that. And all I can hope is that he was just picked up for some other offense, and the only Elvis impersonation he's doing these days is hopefully the Jailhouse Rock. When I was in college, a friend of a friend threw a small Halloween house party. Nothing too wild, just the usual decorations, costumes, punch, apple bobbing, and vodka, the usual. And when we arrived at the party, the center of the living room couch had been taken up by a werewolf. Now, I'd never seen a werewolf mask like it before. It was like something out of a movie. And you would swear that it was a professional prop. His snout looked wet, his maw was glistening with saliva, and his werewolf hair looked genuinely real, and his eyes, man. I had no idea how he even saw out of the mask's eyes. But they were fully realistic eyeballs, just incredible. And this dude was just sort of sitting there in the middle of the couch. If it hadn't been for the fact that he only wore a mask as part of his werewolf costume, I might have assumed that he was a prop. But below the mask he wore a sort of Hawaiian t-shirt and chinos. He had thin, knobby legs, these dirty sneakers, and on his arms he had tattoos that looked suspiciously like prison tattoos. And I figured they were just sort of drawn on, like it was some werewolf character that I didn't know about. Now, I'm not a big werewolf guy, so I figured that I couldn't ID the particular werewolf that he was dressed as. And occasionally, one or two of us would sit next to him and try and talk to him. But man, the dude stayed in character the whole night. At first, he just let out this sort of wheezing growl, and after a while, he'd just sort of stare forward silently. And the party went on, and the werewolf continued to sit there. We began to speculate who he might be. And eventually, it hit. He was our friend Josh, and this was exactly his MO. Last Halloween, he'd come dressed as a mannequin and stood in the corner for an hour before finally moving and scaring the crap out of us. So if it was Josh, we wanted to leave him and see what he'd do. Surely he had a big scare planned for us. Josh did have a big scare planned for us, in fact. At just before midnight, he burst in through the front door dressed as Leatherface, swinging a toy chainsaw. And he apologized for being late, but his car wouldn't start. Now our eyes darted back between Josh and this werewolf, and the werewolf and Josh, and the werewolf just sat there, staring at us, unmoving, and it was beginning to just unsettle us. We explained the situation to Josh, how this werewolf was just sitting there, staring, and he got extra freaked out about it. And so he went over to this guy and says, "Buddy, say something. Buddy, who are you?" No reply. So Josh grabs the werewolf mask and pulls it off. And I'll never forget the sight of that gray face. Yellow bile had dripped from the corner of his mouth. His sightless eyes stared at nothing, and he was clearly and obviously dead. Cue a massive panic as the party dispersed and we called the cops. Thankfully, none of us were under any suspicion, as the autopsy revealed that he'd taken a massive drug overdose, apparently stumbled into our party, sat down, and just sort of quietly died on my buddy's couch. He was just some homeless guy in his 40s, and none of us knew him. The cops couldn't even find a confirmed identity on the guy, and in the end, we were the only ones at his tiny funeral, covered by the state. And for whatever reason, this old homeless guy had decided to pump himself with a cocktail full of drugs, put on the most realistic werewolf mask I'd ever seen, and come to our party to die. The least we could do was just give him some kind of send-off. I still don't know his real name or why he chose our party to end his life, but I still think about him sometimes, and I hope that he's in a better place, living his best life and howling at the moon. In the late 1970s, two drifters crossed paths and discovered a shared darkness that should never have met. Together, they roamed California's quiet roads, searching for victims who would never be seen again. What they carried with them was ordinary: tools, chains, tape. But what they did with them became the stuff of nightmares. Hear the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, all linked down below. Now, to set the scene, most of us are Kiwis living in Australia, and we're an odd bunch. There's me, Chris, and Paul, and we're all from New Zealand, and we all moved over here together. And then we met Rocky, an American bloke who just sort of gelled with us and became the missing member of our quartet. But we were lads who loved to party. We loved a lot of things, us, and didn't take life too seriously. And we weren't, and aren't, haters. But let's read, bro. I hate boats. I don't know if you've ever been on one. You're a YouTuber, so maybe you aspire to own a yacht or some crap like that, and have wild parties out on the deck where everyone gets drunk and imbibes substances. You know that Lonely Island song, I Want a Boat? It makes it look so much fun. Same as movies or shows where rich people go out on yachts and have a great time. Well, don't do it. It sucks. I didn't used to have a fear of open water, but I do now. And it's all because one Halloween, my idiot buddy Rocky decided that we, the boys, should all pool together, rent a yacht, and then pick up some baddies in a coastal bar and tell them that we were some rich Wall Street idiots and go out to sea for a good time. Sounds like a flawless idea, right? Well, yeah, it wasn't. Now, first off, Rocky barely knew how to pilot a boat, so we sort of ended up drifting out to sea for a bit and then dropped anchor and thought, hey, we've got alcohol, someone's brought, well, other things, and we managed to convince about 3 girls to come party with us. Now, never mind the fact that there were 5 of us guys. Only 4 of us were the tight crew, too, and the other guy, he was an Australian fella that we'd met in the bar, and he had the substances and pretty much begged us to let him attend our rich hedge fund party. He said he had some great investment opportunities to run past us. And of course, we weren't hedge fund managers or Wall Street wankers or anything like that. We were more like the schlubs from The Hangover or any Vince Vaughn or Owen Wilson American comedy movie that you can name. Just regular dudes who like to party, who like to try and usually fail hooking up with some honeys, and just have fun. We'd also blown most of our savings on renting this yacht for one day, and the deposit alone was completely eye-watering, which we would lose if any damage occurred to this vessel. And so basically the 4 of us were all a bit jumpy about getting too drunk or wrecked, especially when the Australian guy, who we'll just call Barry, started breaking out the baggies. We realized that Halloween fell on a full moon that year in 2001, and Barry got incredibly excited about this, doing nose candy and howling at the moon as soon as the sun went down. Now please just remember here, we were dumb guys in our early 20s, Barry was probably 35 and we didn't know him at all, and we just invited him onto a boat from which there was no real escape, and the guy was off his head on the powder. Now me and my 2 other buddies, Chris and Paul, were making half-assed attempts to hit on the honeys we picked up, but they were more interested in Barry and his wild antics. Rocky, on the other hand, was absolutely freaking out, worrying about the deposit that we dropped on the yacht and then stressing in general. Eventually, he took me to one side while the others were getting drunk and high with weird Australian Barry. Rocky told me that he'd effed up big style, and a hell of a storm was heading right towards our location. That's fine, I said. We'll just raise anchor and sail back to the docks. We can't be that far out, right? And that's when Rocky tells me that he'd never actually dropped anchor, and the boat had been just drifting slowly further and further out to sea, and he basically just had no idea what in the hell he was doing. And it was almost nature, or God, or someone was playing a prank on us. No sooner had Rocky made this confession that the heavens absolutely opened up and heavy, freezing rain began to pound down in the boat. The girls ran under the cover of the bridge, but there was barely enough space for all of us to fit in the small interior sections of this tiny yacht, the best we could afford. Now Barry, on the other hand, was standing out in the storm. Lightning was striking the water dangerously close by now, and choppy waves had begun rocking us back and forth. Rocky, Paul, and Chris were yelling at each other to navigate back to shore, and the girls were just screaming. Now, I'm not convinced they even knew how to plot the route back. How Rocky had managed to convince the rental company to even let us take the boat out, I'll never know that, but he was always good at bullcrapping his way through situations. But back to Barry, he was hollering and screaming about some sea witch, and I think he called her Shazanzi or something like that, and even 24 years later I've never been able to find any evidence of this so-called sea goddess. Barry was imploring her to save us, and then he paused as if listening for a reply. And this is when one of the girls said something to me that they'd seen Barry taking a whole bunch of LSD, at least 3 tabs. Great. So we had this mysterious Australian drug addict standing out in the storm and holy crap, what was he doing now? He starts to produce a goddamn knife from the boat's toolkit and started carving a sigil into the wooden decking on the boat. Of course, Rocky's first thought was the goddamn deposit and how much money we'd lose, so he runs out into the storm and starts screaming at Barry. Barry cocks his head to one side again and yells that, sure, he'll do what Chazonnet says. And then his face goes very serious, rain was hammering down, lightning striking, and he tells us that because it's Halloween and a full moon, Chazonnet demands 2 sacrifices to release us from her domain. Now calmly, I ask him what he means by that, and he holds up the knife and makes a very obvious slicing gesture across his neck. I tell him, hey buddy, don't hurt yourself, and he laughs and says it's not him that Chazonnet wants as a sacrifice. So I asked him who he wants, and he points to one of the chicks we brought with us, and then Rocky, the only guy who knows how to pilot the damn boat. So of course, I'm not about to let this high-as-heck Australian lunatic sacrifice any of us to his imaginary sea witch. But the storm is closing in, and Rocky's doing his best to navigate the choppy waters before any real danger occurs. At least, any real danger besides the lunatic drug addict who's demanding that Rocky and the girl whose name I don't even remember anymore, but I think it was probably like Belinda, come out and fall on his blade in the name of Chazonnet. And so I'm looking around in the pouring rain, trying to find a way to de-escalate the situation without getting myself stabbed in the face by this madman. I spy a harpoon gun on the floor, but no, couldn't. I'm not shooting this guy with a spear and having that on my conscience. He's drunk and on an LSD trip. He doesn't deserve to die. He seemed like a solid bloke before the sea witch sacrifice crap. Unfortunately, Barry saw me looking at the spear gun and decided to make a move for it, towards me with the knife. He said I wasn't the sacrifice Chazonnet wanted, but he wouldn't let me get in the way of saving the world from the storm that would consume us all. According to him, that's what was going on. This was the apocalypse, and it was on us all, and only the deaths of those 2 random people he just met would save the world, i.e., he was absolutely off his face on drugs. And you know when people are absolutely off their face on drugs, they like to talk, at length. And boy, did Barry talk. So much in fact that he didn't notice one of the chicks was sneaking around to the side of the boat towards Barry. And I remember her name was Krista because we dated for a while after this, but I think it was just a situationship because it didn't really last. And I guess being held captive by a sea god worshipping nutjob isn't the best basis for a long-term relationship. Now anyway, Krista had crept up behind Barry, who was waving this knife in my direction, and she grabbed some kind of pole which I guess was used to fish things out of the sea if they fell overboard. Now Barry was in the middle of some big rant about saving the world. Rain was hammering down, lightning was lighting up the sky, and then wham! Krista smacks Barry in the head with the pole as hard as she could. He staggers, and for a moment I'm not convinced that he's going to go down. And so I dart in like the hero that I always wanted to be and sock him right in the jaw with the best and only punch I'd ever thrown in my life. The knife goes flying out of his hand right overboard and Barry collapses forward. Now quickly, the others, apart from Rocky, who's still trying to steer the boat away from the storm, all come running. They'd found some rope and some other things to secure Barry, and we tie this lunatic Aussie up in the back of the boat, and somehow, thankfully, Rocky managed to guide the boat back into the quay. We're expecting cops to be waiting on our return, or the Coast Guard, or someone, but it was a bit of an anticlimax. I guess Rocky never thought to actually radio the Coast Guard for help, which we still give him crap for to this day. And there was only one person waiting on that dock, and I could tell right away that she was the Karen type. Middle-aged, soaked to the skin, and looked like she was ready to call the manager. And thankfully, her anger was not directed at us. It was directed at Barry. She explained that she was Barry's wife, and took one look at him hog-tied and incapacitated in the back of the boat, and just said something like, "Bloody Nora, not again, you bloody C-word." And before we could even protest, she just climbed on the boat, slapped Barry around in the face 6 ways from Sunday until he woke up, and then sort of marched him to a nearby car, throwing him into the back. Now, I was kind of shocked to realize that she was driving a Bentley, and a pretty nice one at that. We thought she was going to do a runner, and one of my buddies was already writing down their registration plate. But then Karen came back and was surprisingly apologetic. Her excuse? Barry was having some type of midlife crisis and liked to party. We tried to explain that he'd been threatening to sacrifice a couple of us to some sea witch, and Karen just shrugged and said, yeah, he gets a bit weird on Halloween and on a full moon, so she quote-unquote wasn't surprised. Like, okay, lady, this guy sounds like he really isn't safe in modern society, maybe? But he wasn't our problem anymore, at least not when Karen pulled out her checkbook and wrote us a very sizable check to cover the damages that Barry had done to our boat, and any other trauma that we'd actually suffered. Now, we're talking a 5-figure amount here, more than enough to buy our silence, as much as I'm ashamed to say it. And we made sure to plead with Karen to get her husband some help, and she kinda implied that it was an uphill struggle, but they were trying. And then she said that maybe we could join them on their boat sometime, because Barry's not normally like this, I guess. Well, I'd hope not. And she gave me her card, and while we never did take her up on the offer, with no desire to ever see these weirdos again, I did look them up a few years later and realized that we'd been in the presence of a couple of very rich people. So in our quest to impress some hot chicks by pretending we were rich enough to own a boat, we discovered the reality of having the kind of money that turns you into someone like Barry. And after that, I've spent the next 20-odd years feeling perfectly happy that I'm just a lowly mechanic in a small Australian town. And the guys drifted apart, but sometimes we still message on Facebook and talk about the time we were almost sacrificed to an imaginary sea witch during a storm on Halloween. We barely even tell other people the story because it sounds so bat-crap crazy that we usually can't be bothered to even try convincing people it's true. But I figured, hey, I'm getting on in years, so I'll just post it to you, and maybe it'll serve as a cautionary tale for anyone else who randomly decides to rent a boat and sail into a storm during a full moon on Halloween night. So I grew up in a pretty fundamentalist Christian town. Now, I know what you're thinking. Christian communities like that get kind of a bad rap. Look, all I can share is my experience, and I grew up with strong morals, a strict but fair set of rules guiding me, and an understanding and loving of the teachings of Christ that I genuinely believe can make the world a better place if followed properly. Now, I'm not here to have some theological argument, though, but I want to set the scene that I lived in a very traditionally churchy town. I still live there now, and I'm proud to raise my kids here, and that's all I'll say. No, I'm not here to convert anyone else. Free will means that you can believe what you want. That's the beauty of it. But it is important to the story that you understand that from a very young age, I had a strong, willing faith in Christ that I and everyone around me celebrated. Now, we also went completely all out for Halloween. Now, our town, back in the 1980s, genuinely won awards for our parades and decorations. Now, you see, we don't believe that you should shy away from Satan and the demonic. You should confront it, parody it, make fun of it. That's what Halloween is all about to a lot of Christians, and while it has its roots in pagan culture, I actually believe that the way some Christians have adopted it is a legitimately beautiful thing. All this to say, the annual children's Halloween party held at the church hall was a huge gosh darn deal for us local kids. We got to dress up as spooky, scary skeletons, ghosts, witches, beasts. We did draw the line at devils and demons, but I don't know if that was a rule or just an unspoken thing that we just simply didn't want to portray ourselves as directly satanic. But the lore, sort of, was that the townsfolk decorated the place all spooky-like, and if any real evil came to town, then they'd see all this and think, we're not welcome here. We knew it was all metaphorical and silly and a chance to let loose, but I think it was a genuinely nice lesson that our town elders came up with. Halloween was a Saturday that year. I was dressed as a vampire. My buddy, Billy Ukes, decided that he had to go as the Ultimate Warrior from WWF, and it was called that back then, so that brought on a few chuckles. Now, Sally Simpson was a witch, but the good kind. Sammy Hall was a classic skeleton, and you get it. The party, which, as I mentioned, was being held in the church hall, had some sandwiches, little cakes, party rings, jelly and ice cream, and everything a kid's party would actually have. It was decorated with paper bats and pumpkins, and there had even been a pumpkin carving contest that the mayor of the town, who I'll call Mr. Watkins, was going to judge later in the afternoon. And the event was mostly for the kids, but a lot of the adults attended too. It was a real community event. Now, I remember Derek Rogers, the then owner of the local bar, his son still owns it to this day, carried around this sound system down to the church hall and acted as a sort of DJ, playing classic Halloween hits like the Monster Mash and whatever other Halloween songs might have existed back then. I don't really remember too much about the music because Derek Rogers didn't get too far into his set before, I'll just call, the event happened. Now, we were all dancing and jiving and having fun in the middle of the church hall when suddenly, out of the blue, there was a huge crash and an explosion of stone and wood. People started screaming and running away from the direction of that sound. Me, I was just sort of standing there, frozen like some fool. A gosh darn truck, complete with wicked-looking metal roll bars on the front, had just crashed through the side of the church hall. I recognized the truck. It belonged to the handyman that I'd seen around town recently, and he was a newcomer, and we all noticed newcomers. I'd heard my mom and pops talk about how he spent almost all of his spare hours, when he wasn't doing odd jobs for cash, praying in the church. Nobody really knew where he lived, and they said maybe he just lived in his truck. He yelled at me one time when I'd been walking past his truck parked on the sidewalk where I was painting Widow Young's front porch. And he told me to get away from his goddamn property, and he knew what us young spawn of the devil were like. And he used language that I don't think no God-fearing man should actually use, especially to a kid, but I figured God must love him because he had a cross tattooed over his heart, which you could see when he was doing his labor. Now, though, he was leaping out of this truck, stumbling over the debris, and pointing at us kids. In one of his hands, he held some rusty tire iron, and I can't remember what he said word for word, but it was something like, "Spawns of Satan, little demons, I knew you were infesting the town with your effing evil, your goblins, and I can see through the masks you wear, and you're all gonna die." Of course, this made most of the kids start screaming, crying, running to their parents at the back of the room, and everyone was still a little shell-shocked from the truck coming crashing through the church hall wall, and most of the kids were younger than me and my friends. We were 8 and 9, and most of them were 5 or 6-year-olds. Now, my protector instincts kicked in at that moment, and I spat out my little vampire fangs that I was wearing, which were annoying as heck anyway, and I definitely yelled at this handyman. "We ain't no evildoers, sir. We love Jesus just like you do." I might have been a little delirious given the situation. Then he said something I did not expect. He said that our town was infested with evil because we allowed, well, let's just say I can't repeat what he said, but they were certain racial slurs that implied that he did not believe non-white people should be allowed to live in our town. Then this absolute weirdo rips his shirt off, and I saw that he had some other tattoos which were sort of cross-shaped but not, and I think you can probably imagine the design that I'm talking about. So there I was, an 8-year-old kid facing down some racist who represented everything that I and Christ himself stood against. My little hands balled up into fists, and this handyman stared at me, totally fixated on me as he took one step towards me, and then another. I heard the sound of a gun being cocked, and then another, and then another. 7 of the adults had finally arrived on the scene. White, black, Latino, a multicultural mix of the beloved members of our community, our loved ones, the people this hateful man who'd risked killing a group of kids had decided were evil. One of the folks was my own dad. He put a hand on my shoulder and gently guided me behind him, whispering that I'd done good. And 7 guns were trained on this guy. I prayed to God, prayed harder than I ever had in my life that he wouldn't be stupid enough to charge at them and cause a firefight. I said the prayer, first under my breath and then louder and louder. "Jesus, forgive this man," I said. My mom had run up from behind and was trying to drag me away in case things did get violent, but I kept praying. And this handyman raised his tire iron, and he seemed like he was going to charge them. And then a gun went off. It was my dad's gun. And Dad had never been a good shot until Carl had always teased him for it, and to this day, I don't know if Dad's aim was true or off the mark, and he claims that he hit exactly where he had wanted to hit. And that bullet hit the handyman right in the hand holding the tire iron. Immediately, he dropped the weapon and began howling in pain. Dad just kind of stood there, frozen, while the other gun-toting townsfolk ran in, kicked the handyman's legs out from under him, and then held him forcibly at gunpoint until the sheriff's backup finally arrived. This handyman was arrested, charged, and sent to prison upstate. Now, I don't know exactly what the charges were brought on him, and I don't really want to know. All I know is that I attended a Halloween party where a deranged, misguided soul almost drove his truck into us, and then in my opinion we avoided any loss of life or serious trauma thanks to the love of Jesus, the bravery of the townsfolk, my defiant inability to back down, and most importantly, we were saved by my dad's absolutely abysmal aim. And this was near 40 years ago, and the old man's still around. He still can't hit a barn door with a banjo, and honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. I didn't have any plans to celebrate Halloween this year. I bought some candy on the small chance that kids in my apartment block might trick-or-treat, but it had never happened before, so I didn't expect it this year. Not only that, I was working late at the office, and by the time I began the walk home, it was past 10 at night. Now, usually I get a taxi, or these days an Uber, but it was Halloween and the streets were pretty busy. It felt safe enough to walk the few blocks home, or so I thought anyway. And there were crowds milling about in costume in the streets where my office used to be, so I sort of mingled among them for a while, making my way to the next block. I expected the festivities to be continuing on that block, but no. It was like it had been completely and utterly abandoned. Wherever the crowds were headed, it wasn't this way. Well, that was fine by me. I hurried down this darkened commercial street, my heels clacking against the pavement, the only sound echoing around the darkened buildings. And then I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow, methodical, and in perfect time to my own steps. Anyone who's ever walked home alone at night will recognize the sound. It's the sound of being followed. So I sped up, and I couldn't risk looking over my shoulder. A large man was walking behind me, and there was no doubt that he was following me. When I stopped, he stopped, and when I sped up, he sped up too. I hurried to the end of the block and stopped, looking for a direction to turn, and that's when I saw him pointing at me. He seemed to be wearing black gloves, and I could barely see his face, but there was no mistaking it as a threat. His pointing spoke volumes, this, "I'm coming for you and I'm going to get you." And that's when I remembered the crowd on the other block. I tried to recall which direction they'd been heading, and I thought that I could cut through to wherever they were going if I went right. Now, not caring, I kicked off my heels so I could run easier in my stockinged feet and sprinted down to the next street. And the further I got, the more I realized that I could hear the sound of music and partying. But behind me, I could hear the thundering sound of these footsteps behind me, and the stalker was clearly following me still. Thankfully, I was fit and fast and worked out regularly. He was a big man, and I was confident that I could outrun him. And I was right. I burst out into a throng of masked demonic figures, and hot damn, I'd forgotten that my city's debut Halloween parade was happening this year. We'd never done it before, a big street party with floats and performers and all sorts of stuff like that, and holy crap, this was the perfect place to lose my pursuer. I pushed through the crowd, not caring if I was disrupting people. Nobody seemed to care as they were all partying and dancing around the parade float that was currently driving down the street. On it were dancing skeletons and corpses popping out of coffins, and the creepiest song I think I'd ever heard in my damn life was playing from the speakers. And then the worms crawl in, the worms crawl out, something, and you'll be the first to die were the lyrics. And for the first time, I genuinely wondered if I'd fallen asleep at my desk and was dreaming that I was in some horror movie. But someone knocked into me, sending pain through my shoulder, and I realized this was very real. Not only that, the man who'd been following me was now creeping down the side of the hearse float. I started to run again, heading towards the end of the parade, and crashed straight into a group of college-aged guys, spilling one of their beers all down their front. Now, I quickly started to apologize and explain that I was being stalked by a man who actually was going to hurt me, and I thought that they would help me. Instead, they just began tugging at me, demanding that I pay for their drink. One of them tried to grab my purse, and another, clearly off his face drunk, pulled me to him and asked for a kiss. Now, I'd run from one danger straight into another. These young men were clawing at me, snatching at me, and all I could do was scream for help and try and batter them with my purse. I cracked one of them in the side of the head, and he yelled out in pain, but by now, the parade float had reached us and the music was just blaring. The worms crawled in, the worms crawled out, I remember. And then, from atop that float itself, some beefy, muscular skeleton started yelling, and he was screaming at those guys, asking what the hell they thought they were doing. Then he starts to jump off the moving float and coming towards us. He was clearly a big guy, and so were the other skeleton figures who had joined him. They'd been performing on the parade float, but as soon as they saw these drunk frat bros assaulting me, they leaped to my defense, thankfully. Now, these boys scattered into the crowd, yelling and just making vague, drunken threats. I thanked the skeletons, and they explained the direction the parade was going and the quickest route that I could take to get back to my area of the city. It was only a couple of blocks away, and I'd just gotten turned around and lost in all the confusion. The Halloween decorations and party equipment made the area look almost alien, and so I made my way home, and I was almost at my apartment block just a building or two away when something caused me to stop and turn. The stalker. I'd completely forgotten all about him, but he was stood there at the end of the street, a hood covering his face, one black glove held out, pointing at me. Our eyes were meeting, or at least I think they did, and I could barely see his face under the shadow of that hood. And then he began to run, charging straight at me. I turned around and fled as fast as I could to my apartment door, swiping the security key and diving inside and slamming the electric door behind me. The night guard looked up at me in surprise, and I blurted out what had just happened. And together we watched and waited for that stalker to appear in front of the door, as at the same time the night guard called the cops. The stalker never showed up, though. For whatever reason, he stopped following me just before he reached the building. We called the cops, and they checked what little CCTV footage there was on the route home, but with all that Halloween parade and the dark costume the stalker was wearing, the best they got was some blurry shot of me running down the street pursued by some dark shape. And to this day, I have no idea who that stalker was. I've never seen him again, and this was almost 6 years ago now, and every single day I expect to see him following me. I never walk home alone anymore, and I never attend Halloween parades either. Both events on the same night get me a little nervous, and Halloween can be genuinely terrifying, and not always in the ways you expect. So I was at a Halloween party back in 2001, and it was the craziest night of my life. I'll never forget it, even though I kind of wish I could. I didn't really know anyone there apart from the girl who had brought me, because we were kind of hooking up at the time. She was a bit of a hood rat, and so were her friends. And when we got there, there was one chick just passed out on the front lawn, her skirt hitched up to reveal her underwear and just sleeping out there with no shame. But what the hell, right? I'd seen worse at frat parties. Now, little did I realize that this sleeping beauty would become the beast of my Halloween. And an hour or so had passed at that point when we were all inside dancing and having fun and enjoying life. And then suddenly, the sleeping psycho comes crashing into the house, screaming that she just had a prophetic dream that the punch had been spiked, with strychnine of all things. And then her eyes lit on me. She pointed and started screaming. I was the one. I was the stranger among them. I'd spiked the punch and was trying to enact some type of apocalypse prophecy. And I'm just sitting there like, no? But for some insane reason, half the party started to turn on me with some sort of suspicion. And someone yelled that they thought the punch had tasted a bit strange, and another person had shouted that they'd seen me pour something into the bowl. Of course, none of this damn crap had actually happened. I'm not Jim Jones. I was just there for a good time, but half the party didn't seem to be having it. And then the other half decided to come to my defense, and of course this was all insane. It was just Glenda, who was always making up conspiracies and did actually have mental problems. So then this big fight broke out over me while I'm there ducking and dodging and diving to get away from this group of absolute idiots. And all the while, this Glenda lady is just screaming about how I'm the Antichrist and put strychnine in the punch. And at the time, I didn't even know what strychnine was. A group of guys seemed to believe her because they started grabbing me, holding me down, punching me. And at that point, I thought this was it. I was probably dead. All these drunk idiots were going to kill me. I even tried to fight back, but it was at this point 5 versus 1. And then some other group of guys attacked them, and at that point it just gave me a chance to get free. And I ran like the wind, jumped into my car and just hightailed it out of there. I didn't give a crap about the girl who invited me. They were her psycho friends. And as soon as I was far enough away, I called the cops. Now, I had heard the party got shut down, and of course there was no trace of that strychnine or any other poison in the punch. And I never spoke to any of them again, and I never wanted to. It was the most pointlessly and terrifying night of my life, and I have to be honest, I've avoided Halloween parties or really any parties ever since, especially the punch. So I got a weird Halloween story for you. My buddies and I were on the way to a haunted house attraction that doubled as a Halloween party. It was sort of what you call a bespoke thing set up by a friend of ours. I just turned 21, so I was used to relying on other people to supply the alcohol at various keggers and gatherings. And then as we drove to the host's house in the hills, it struck me as, holy crap, I was old enough to legally buy alcohol and bring some beers to the party and finally wouldn't feel like such a scab who was always begging other people for beer. And this was the first time that I'd stopped at a convenience store to buy alcohol, and I was buzzed. I had ID with me and I could legally buy whatever things I wanted and nobody could stop me. Vodka, rum and gin, and that's what I decided. I told my 2 pals to wait in the car and they were both 20, and I had a vague memory that some places won't serve you if you're with minors. I didn't want to risk anything getting in the way of this rite of passage, so I just sort of went across the parking lot, head in the clouds, and pushed open the door of the convenience store with the confidence of a 21-year-old who no longer has to rely on some fake ID to inevitably fail to buy beer. And the guy at the cash register was some scrawny guy who looked just a bit older than me. He gave me this weird, suspicious look that I interpreted as, "You're underage, aren't you?" And so I shot him this wide, confident smile. Fair enough, I thought. I do have kind of a baby face, so I snatched up a basket to fill with my legitimately gotten gains, and I decided to take my time, browsing the snacks, and maybe I'd buy some Funyuns or Takis or some other snacks for my buddies and I. Beef jerky, that was good, and into the basket that went. Candy corn, that was always a Halloween staple too. And I look over my shoulder at the cashier, and he seemed to be sweating profusely. He wasn't looking at me, though. He was just looking at the mirror in the corner that reflected all of the store. I followed his gaze. My heart, at that moment, absolutely sank. Crouched down an aisle away from me was a man wearing a balaclava and clutching what seemed to be a shotgun. Immediately, I realized what had happened. He'd been in the process of robbing the store when we pulled into the lot, and I just sort of walked into the middle of some stick-up. Instead of turning me into bloody paste, the guy had clearly decided to hide behind some stacks with his shotgun pointed at the clerk as a warning. And the clerk asked me if I'd found everything I needed, clearly trying to encourage me to pay and get out, and to call for help. I went along with it, telling him that, yeah, I was done. And there was clearly a tremor in my voice, though, and in my own head it sounded like I was pooping bricks. I glanced up at the reflective mirror and saw the gunman beginning to stand up. Oh God, I thought he had clocked me. And I saw his black masked head appear over the aisle, and he did, in fact, clock me. He told me to move to the front of the store. His voice was muffled through that woolen mask, and I obeyed, just trying not to pee myself. And I have no idea why, but I kept hold of my basket of groceries the whole time. The gunman stepped forward, gesturing for me to stand behind the store clerk so we were both within range of that potential shotgun blast. And this was it. I felt like I was going to die. I said a quick prayer, and hoped upon hope that my buddies in the car had somehow noticed what was going on from the vehicle and called the cops on their cell phones. All I had to do was just stall for time. "What's brought you here today, buddy?" I remember asking the gunman, and it was the first thing I could think to ask. A dumb question, and he knew it, and I could tell that he was pretty frustrated as he replied, telling me that he was here to rob the place, obviously, and I figured maybe I'd try and appeal to his human side. "I'm just here for the spirits," I said. "Going to a haunted house. I thought I'd pick up some spirits for the festivities." And the guy was wearing a black mask, but I swear I saw him go pale. His eyes were widened, and I had no idea what I'd said or done to affect him so much. And then he asked me, "This place has spirits?" I was baffled. Of course it did. It was a wine and spirits and liquor store. And the gunman's eyes were darting around and the shotgun was shaking in his hands. And that's when I had the dumbest revelation of my life. He thought I meant freaking ghosts. He thought I was here to recruit actual dead spirits to come with me to a haunted house. And then he asked me if they speak to me too, if I hear their voices calling to me, because he does. He said the spirits told him to come here today and rob this place. And at that point, I just winged it. I told him that's what they're like here. They're trickster spirits. They're trying to corrupt him so the devil could claim his soul. And this was my job to guide them to a nearby haunted house where they could be at peace. Now, I was rambling, just making up any crap I could think of, because from the way his hands were shaking, it looked like he was buying it. I told him that he shouldn't give in and shouldn't listen to the voices. He told me that he usually takes medication to keep the voices quiet, but he hadn't been able to afford it for a while, that his dealer was out of town. Great. So this guy was suffering from probably heroin withdrawals and hearing ghostly voices, and had a shaking, sawed-off shotgun pointed directly at us. And suddenly, I heard distant sirens getting very quickly closer. I didn't look out, I just continued to pray that the cops would de-escalate the situation before he could fire off a shot. And what happened next, I cannot explain. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. A bottle of vodka fell off the shelf. It just sort of fell off and smashed onto the ground behind the gunman. Now, the rational part of me knows that he must have knocked it when he was ducking down back there, or maybe it was just sort of poorly stacked, but late at night, when I have flashbacks to this hostage situation, I can't help imagine a spectral figure giving that bottle a little nudge. I know that didn't happen, but it was a miracle nonetheless. At that moment, the gunman whirled around at the sound of the glass breaking, and when he saw it was a bottle of spirits, he let out a scream that I swear could have woken the dead. And then, oh my God, this is the part that I wish I could forget. I heard a gunshot, and the gunman's head exploded. He'd put the sawed-off into his own mouth and pulled the trigger. I heard the bell over the door sound, heard the cops running in, yelling for me to get down on the ground, and I just complied in some type of daze. My ears were ringing from the sound of the shotgun blasts, and there was blood and all sorts of stuff all over and on me, and to this day when I look in the mirror, I'm convinced that I haven't washed all of it off. Later, we discovered that the gunman had some history of some pretty severe mental illness and drug use. He'd been in and out of facilities his entire life, didn't receive remotely the appropriate mental health care, and he turned to heroin to drown out the voices, and when that all dried up, those voices came back, and all it took was for me to mention spirits and an ill-placed bottle to end his tragic life. We never did go to that haunted house party, and I've never celebrated Halloween since. I think I'm haunted enough